Hey guys, Roger here. So, test-driven development is something that a lot of you guys have talked about wanting to do, but also expressed that it's difficult to learn how to do and to get into the habit of doing and to retrain your mind to do it. So, I'm creating this screencast to basically show you how I do it, and hopefully you find it useful and it can help some of you start to retrain yourself on doing this really cool way of development. So these are the three rules of TDD, but I like to do something slightly different. Um, Basically, the first step is write the smallest test that you can, have it fail, write just enough code to make it pass, and then repeat. And I'll demonstrate this on a simple method that I'm going to create for you for demonstration purposes. There's two rules of thumb that I would highly recommend doing. Um, One is when you create a file, create a spec file at the same time. That is very, very important. And then when you create a method, create the method spec immediately. Okay, so if you can get into the habit of doing these two things, that whenever you create a new file for any reason, whether it's a service or a controller or whatever, you instantly go and create the spec file, and then whenever you start creating an actual method, you start writing def something, you just absolutely have to go create that describe or it statement. If you can do those two things, that's the biggest part of the battle, in my opinion, and you'll be well on your way of doing that. So anyway, so let's go ahead and I'll demonstrate what I mean by this. This is the problem that we're going to solve. So basically, on the overall step, as the user types in characters, it basically tells you, gives you recommendations. I'll show you what this looks like. So basically, as you type in here, it says keep going until you get to a certain character count. And this gets determined in this algorithm by what you do here. So basically, if I do a lot, then it's going to recommend 800 characters for the that I have to type in. If I do one of the sums, it's going to subtract 100. So this would be a recommendation of 700. This would be 600. This would be 500. All right. Now, if you have a very little answer, it subtracts 400. So right now it's 800. This would be 400. And then it could go to 0, but part of the logic on this is that there's a minimum number of 200 characters. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, let's go to RubyMine. And one thing I like to do is I like to have the code on one and the spec on the other. So I do split screen. And if any of you guys are pairing, I'll give you a secret. You have one person write the tests and the other person write the code. That goes really well, and it's a lot easier to do it that way than to have one person watching while the other person is trying to stay engaged and not get too bored. So first thing I need to do is I need to think of a good method name, and I'm going to write it in the spec first. So first test should be method exists, and actually let me do describe, and what are we going to call this? We'll call this recommended quick check characters. Okay. And I'll move this over here. So I'm going to do. So I'm going to do expect. I'm going to use curly brackets here because I'm going to make sure it doesn't raise an error. I'll just copy this. Sorry if this screen is looking a little dark for some reason. Okay, so Actually, this is a helper method, so I'm going to need to do helper dot method. And then we'll do to not raise error. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and run this. Notice I run it even though I realize I know it's going to fail. And that's an important habit to get into. Run the test and let it fail before you write the code to make it pass. So the tests are going to run a little bit slow on this. Let me see if I can get my screen a little bit brighter here. Okay. So it fails. Now, write just enough code to let it pass. So I'm just going to do def. Now just copy this over. Now it should pass. By the way, in RubyMind, if you do a right mouse click, you can run that particular line, or the block, basically. So I like to use that. And then when you want to run it again, there's going to be a play button over here that you can do. So this is going to pass. Now, one thing I just remembered was that I'm going to be depending on the decision to figure out what the uncertainty, conflict, and discussion is. So let me create a factory here. Do let decision, create decision. Okay. And so I'm going to pass this. I'm going to expect this to be passed to the method. And I'm not sure what this is going to do, but it probably will raise an error. So let's go ahead and run it again, see what happens. So let the test fail. And when you're running this without recording the screen, the test should go much faster than what's happening here. But anyway, while you're pairing, you can imagine, okay, one of the guys writing this, the other guy's writing this. It works. Okay, so this time I'm going to do decision. Receive decision as an argument. I'm going to run that, and that should pass. While we're waiting for that, let's go back to the requirements and refresh our memory. Okay, so starting number of characters is 800. So if I answer a lot for everything, I should get 800. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Test passed. Okay, so method exists. If a lot is for all entries, then return 800. Okay. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do decision update and specify that uncertainty is a lot. Oops. Oops. And then conflict a lot and discussion a lot. Okay. Now, oops, sorry, expect helper recommended characters decision to return or to equal 800. All right, I'm going to run the test and I expect it to fail. Now, here's the tricky part on TDD. According to TDD, you should only write enough code to make it pass. And in this, the most simplest way possible. And that would be hard coding 800. So this should pass the test. And this seems kind of crazy a little bit, but it gets you into the right habit of doing things in very small pieces. going back and forth. It's almost like playing table tennis or ping pong with yourself or with your pair partner. And so if you learn how to do that, it will actually pay off if you can get yourself into the habit of doing this. Okay, looks like I have a problem here. Decision, update, uncertainty. Okay, here's the problem. I'm not doing that right. Okay, let's run it again. Got a little bit of an error there. Okay. This is the new Ruby mine, and it puts in these little words like matcher here, which is interesting. Okay, I just downloaded it recently. Okay, so now what I'll do, I'm going to assume that this is going to pass while we're waiting for it to run. Okay, so let's do a block for when we have some entries. Okay, so describe there are some entries. Okay, and I'm just going to write a couple tests here. Well, at least not write the test, but kind of put what I think should be tested. So one sum and two sums and then all sums. Okay, so but I only want to do this. Kind of helps me think out the test coverage I want to have, but I'm just going to do one at a time. So let's copy this, and we'll just change this middle one to sum. And I'm going to copy this here, go down, and this should be 700. Okay, and notice I'm not just running. I'm running all the tests because if I do something that breaks something previously, then I want to know that. So what I'll do is, I'm assuming this is going to fail. Sorry it's taking so long to run. So what I'll do is I'll start writing code. So when I'm thinking about this, how to write the code for this, I'm going to say characters equals 800, and then I'm going to return characters down here, and then we can put the logic between these two things. So let me think about how to do this. Probably what I'm thinking is I'm going to loop through all three of those fields. So I'll do decision, uncertainty, decision, discussion, decision, conflict. Each do, and then answer, and then characters minus equal 100 if answer equals sum. So I expect that this will pass, this here. Now this will probably also pass my test that I haven't written yet, so that might be cheating a little bit, but it's actually the first thing that came to my mind in how to solve this. So I'll give myself some slack on that. I'm going to copy and paste this here, and I'll write another sum. And then at this point, this would be 600. And I'll go ahead and just go ahead and write this test 2, even though that's cheating a little bit. Do all three. And that would be 500. So let's go ahead and run this. Oh, this should pass. Okay. Okay, so at this point, we expect this to pass, and I'll go back to my requirements real quick. So if there's a very little, then it would subtract 400. So let's do describe. Actually, I think what I'll do is I can just, well, yeah, I'll just copy. No, I don't want to copy that. That'll be too much. So let's just do. So how do I word that? There are very little entries. All right. One very little. Two very littles. Okay. So if I have, I'll do is I'll come and copy this one here. Instead of some, we'll change this to very little. Okay, I'm going to run the whole thing here just to make sure I cover everything. This will probably fail. Well, it'll pass except for this one will fail for sure. And while that is running, I'll cheat and go ahead and start writing code. So it subtracts 400 if there's an answer that's very little. And it looks like we got one failure. That's what we expected. Click on it, it goes right to where it failed. So let's run it again. And now it should pass. Now, while that's running, I'm going to go back. So remember, minimum number of characters 200. If I have more than one very little, that would take it to 0. So I need to basically, so I'm going to write this test so that to take into account the minimum. So very little, and then I would expect this to be 200 because it'll go down to below that, and that's the minimum. Very little. That didn't seem to. Where did that fail? Oh, I had the test was wrong. Okay, so this would be 400, and then this will be 200. Okay, so now we'll run the tests again. Okay, and I'll expect everything to pass except for this one. This one will fail because this will actually return 0. So what I'll do is characters equals 200 if characters is less than 200. Okay, as I expected, we got the failure that we were hoping to get, and now we'll run it again, and everything should pass. So how can I break this? Now that's one thing you're always thinking about when you're doing TD is what can go wrong. So one thing we haven't tested is variations. Describe mix of values. So for example, if I do, I'm just going to make this an it statement because I'm feeling pretty good about the algorithm here. I don't think we need to go too crazy. So if I go very little, some, and a lot, that would be 300. That should be 300, right? So it starts at 800, 700 with the sum, minus 400 would be 300. So I'm going to copy this, paste it, and this should be 300. And we'll run it, and this should pass. Now, one thing that could happen that can go wrong is, let's say there is no values entered for uncertainty discussion concerns. And that's the one thing, when you're writing TDD, you're thinking of breaking it before you're writing the code. And after you write the code, you don't want to break it, so you're not going to think of that too much. But I'm thinking of it now. So I'm going to say, if there are missing entries, what should happen? What do we want to have happen? I would say that if there's something missing, let me think about that. Do we want it to treat a missing entry as if it's very little? Or do we want to return just blank? Do we want to return as 800? I can imagine that in the future we have abbreviated, flows, because me and the flow refactor team are working on that. So I can foresee situations where people are answering a page. They're on one of the questionnaire pages, and they didn't enter there is no context or something. Maybe that's possible. I'm going to just say I wanted to treat. I'm going to say that if there's something missing, we're going to treat it as a very little. So it doesn't crash. It just assumes that it's very little. Okay, so I'm just going to make that call. You guys can tell me if you disagree with that. But the big thing is I'm thinking about strange things happening before they happen, right? So if I do a lot, and then something is just set to nil for some crazy reason, how I want this to behave is just to treat it as if it's very little. So nils would be a very little. So I'm gonna, that's what I want to have happen instead of crashing or throwing an error. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. This is going to fail, obviously. What do I think is going to happen? It's probably going to return 800 because it's not going to trigger these things. So while that's running, I can assume it's going to fail. I'm going to say, I'm just going to add a conditional here. Or answer blank. Okay, let me make this a little easier to read. Yep, okay. So now I expect everything to pass. So that's the big thing is, now at this point, there's probably some consolidation of tests I could do. I can make it a little bit more readable. I can organize it. I can maybe even do loops that does all sorts of crazy things. Like, for example, I can get every variation imaginable of a lot, sum, and just kind of like consolidate all this into one test. So there's some things I can do to improve this, but we'll save that for another time, and we'll leave it at there. So hopefully that this is giving you guys some insight on how to get started on TDD. And once again, we'll just quickly go over this again. The 3 rules is always, whenever you create a file, create the spec file. Whenever you create a method, create the spec. Write the smallest test you can, have it fail, write just enough code to make it pass. And then also, when pairing, ping pong between one test writer and one code writer. And you can do that for like 30 minutes and then switch who writes the test versus who writes the code. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this and that you found it useful. Let me know if you have any thoughts, and